To start, I would of course like to express my gratitude to the Center for Bhutan and GNH Studies, the International Buddhist Committee, the monastic body, and of course to their Majesties, the King and Queen of Bhutan. It is especially meaningful to me to be able to present this here because today I will be presenting on the reality and history of a Vajrayana king in the world's only Vajrayana kingdom. And so this is extremely special for me. So today I'll be presenting Proving Gesar, a Multicultural Approach. Since we don't have a full sound system and there are a few videos, I will ask that you be very quiet during the videos just so everyone can hear. Also, 계속해서 이제 옆으로 마시나 슬라이드 정말 보이 요래 아니 최대 요래 then 계속해서 보면 주나 된데 늘어나. Also, I am a Jew from New York with a lot to say, so I'm going to be speaking fast. No apologies, though. All right, let's get this going. I would like to start with this brief homage to King Gesar. So, when we start talking about proving Gesar through multiple perspectives, we need to understand that ideas of proof differ vastly across cultures. The Western ideas of proof developed in the 17th century in the Enlightenment, with the Royal Society of Sciences giving some sort of stamp of legitimacy and a de facto patent to validity and proof. Proof was found in a laboratory. It was labeled in Latin, and it was based on cause validity. In Himalayan societies and Vajrayana thought, however, proof is based on results. Therefore, a miraculous event that may not be explained by science can be proven as valid based on the fact that the result must have a cause. In this discussion, I will talk about these two research perspectives in regards to King Gesar of Ling as a historical and Vajrayana figure. How do societies try or not try to prove his validity? What is validity in different viewpoints, and how does it impact the research on King Gesar of Ling? Finally, I will look at the negative impact that Eurocentrism has had on Vajrayana research. So a brief intro to the King Gesar of Ling for those of you who know less about it. The epic is approximately 900 years old. It is the tale of King Gesar and his conquests. It is the world's longest epic poem, we'll talk about that a bit later, and it is told as both a religious and secular story depending on the region and culture. It is mainly told throughout Ladakh and Baltistan, the greater Mongolia region, and the Tibetan plateau, including the lower Himalayas. And furthermore, it has a religious impact as the characters are emanations. The historical veracity has largely been unexplored by the West, but there are some historical references to contemporaneous political activities that indicate there was a king at that time performing these conquests. Some view Gesar as purely fictional, some say he's real but exaggerated. Others would say that he is completely real according to the text. As I mentioned before, it's the world's longest epic poem. The general count is 40 million words. But this is debated because, first of all, it continues to expand due to things such as reincarnation of members of the epic, perma, and inspired bards known as Babdong, Derdong, and Dadong. While these are considered canonical from a Vajrayana standpoint, they are generally not considered canonical by a Western scholarship standpoint. Basically, we have our classic story, conquering king through the framework of the struggle for the Buddha Dharma to thrive in the early Buddhist period of Tibet. Gesar is considered an incarnation of the Bodhisattva Tokugawa and was either sent by or is an emanation of Guru Rinpoche. His birth on earth is solely to destroy the demons that hate the Dharma, and all of the major figures are emanations. For example, Queen Singdom Dukmo is Tara, and Akuchotong is Red High Riva. There are battles for land, honor, dharma, and wealth. Different regions tell the story differently, but there is a central corpus that includes the horse race, whirling battles, and a few others. When we look at Gesar and Vajrayana, we should consider the fact that many view Gesar as a Dzogchen teaching, and it is formally taken as such in many temples and monasteries. Mipam Rinpoche, or Mipam the Great, even composed a Gesar Guru Yoga in which Gesar is described as inseparable from Guru Rinpoche. And in the invocation at the beginning, which was also written by Mipam, you saw the same reference. As referenced before, all the major characters are emanations, and as such, worshipping them or having them as yidams is acceptable from this viewpoint. In addition to the Guru Yoga of Mipam, we have Tana Monastery located in Nangchen in Kham. Tana, or Jangtana, is notable as the last Yelpa Kagyu monastery in the world. No, the Yelpa Kagyus are not extinct. They're very proud of the fact that one of their nakbas, Anya Janchu Dungul, was Gesar's own Tsawe Lama. The temple contains numerous Gesar shrines, and the mountain across from it has the stupas of the 30 heroes. They also have a warehouse full of artifacts that allegedly belong to Gesar and his retinue, and many practices, including the Guru Yoga, smoke offerings, and others. There is also the Lingzhou, or Lingzhou the Zhenrongmo, which is another terma brought about by Jumipon Rinpoche and then transmitted through Rajini Rinpoche. This yoga tantra includes visualizing oneself as the deity and the stage as the Buddha field. While it was traditionally a secret practice, it has become more public in the past 40 years. And a second form of it is practiced in Tibet as disseminated by Khinchen Jigme Punso. And this is a very unique practice in part because it's practiced by laity instead of the monastics. Although monastics are allowed to practice it, it's less common. So provability in the Tibetan and Himalayan Vajrayana view. In Vajrayana, miraculous events are viewed as evidence. So one of the forms of evidence is the inspired bard. And here we're going to have some specialist vocabulary. So let's do a quick run through. A Jongba is a Gesar bard. Babjong receives it through divine inspiration. Terjong receives it as a kirtan. Dajong looks in a mirror and sees it. And then we have what we could call standard bards. Shejong, they recite it from memory. And Yigzhong, who read aloud from books. The story of the origins of the Babjong and Jajong is generally the same. Usually you have a person very often illiterate. They will fall asleep by a mountain or sacred lake, have a dream, and when they wake up they will be able to recite the epic. Often they cannot do it without break, and so they must go to a high lama who clears their central channels. Apparently this can be very unpleasant, and then after that they are able to perform it. So I have here a couple videos. So this first video is of a Jajong. You're going to see him do the invocation. He is not in trance yet, but I want you to start watching for the twitching of the face and the quick breathing through the nose, which you will also see with other pose and oracles. And this is what happens when he gets up to speed. I think if a picture's worth 1,000 words, I'm not sure what a video is worth. But what is especially interesting about this is we also have cases of incarnations from the epic, the most famous, of course, being Khenpo Jigme Phuntsol himself, who was considered an incarnation of Binse, one of the warriors and son of General Denma of Gesar's army. There are, of course, the standard bard reciters, but interestingly, as far as I've found, there have been no cases of inspired trance reciters outside of the Tibetan Plateau, Himalayas, and Greater Mongolia. There has, however, been an explosion of cases in trance reciters since the Cultural Revolution, including 16 in Yushu alone. And it is viewed as evidence by believers in Gesar that Gesar is personally trying to revive this practice. That said, it is not simply taken for granted. There are tests of bardic validity used among the Tibetan people. Chopa Tondrup, a government-based scholar in Xining who specializes in Gesar, says that the inspired bard must be able to recite a minimum of 100 sections. Gaman a Gesar researcher based in Jegundo, says they must be able to recite for several days without break, which a Yikzhong will not be able to do. Government recognized and sanctioned bards such as Jiangsu says that while a Yikzhong's repertoire will be limited, an inspired bard will not. And therefore, if you were to say, ask them, can you perform Atakzong? And if it wasn't the Yikzhong's specialty, he would not be able to, but the inspired bard would go into trance and have no problem. Everyone agreed that an inspired bard could be tested on sight alone, but these tests would not be considered definitive in the West. Interestingly, these tests are not only definitive among the Tibetans, but also the Chinese government, which successfully petitioned in 2009 for UNESCO to recognize Gesar as a World Heritage Item. There are also Gesar termas, of which the Lingzhou is one. Mind termas are the hardest to verify, but they are judged in content. For example, they must match the teachings of Guru Rinpoche and then expand upon them. There's also been a rise in physical terma finding recently, which has inspired faith from some and scorn from others, and a lot of hilarious social media mockery. Oops, sorry. We also have Gesar validity by virtue of practice. The question posed by devotees is, how can Gesar not be real when his teachings have an effect? According to the concept of lejunde, or karma of cause and effect, it is impossible for a valid effect to exist without a valid relevant cause. And since there are people who have attained high realization or siddhis, such as Khenpo Dorjong of Dachika, who is said to have attained pure sight and clairvoyance solely through Gesar practice, the effect is seen to be proving the cause as true. On the other hand, we have concepts of provability in the West. These were defined in the 17th century during the Enlightenment, a term which I find interesting while writing this, because the Western Enlightenment strives to go as far from the mind as possible. Emotions and philosophy are considered imprecise. In the 17th century, there was the debate between natural philosopher Thomas Hobbes and scientist Robert Boyle. Boyle's air pump experiment, which was actually referenced by another speaker already, was considered the first standard of scientific experimentation in the West, and thus viewed as eventually defeating Hobbes. This can be said to be the death of Western philosophy, or the Western philosophical era. But ironically, the scientific method was then canonized and created its own dogma of certain ideas and refusal to question said foundational ideas, which defeats the entire purpose of scientific experimentation. Western ideas of proof tend to lean towards what we could call member accounts. Members of the inside group are believed, while outsiders are not. One of the best examples of this would be Sir Robert Ross, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1902 for discovering that malaria was carried by mosquitoes. Meanwhile, 2,000 plus years ago, the Sanskrit text, the Sushruta Samhita, perfectly explained every single symptom of malaria, declared it its own disease, and said, "Did you know it's caused by the bite of mosquitoes?" 2,000 years later, Sir Robert Ross gets awarded the Nobel Prize in 1902 for his discovery that Indians had been yelling at the white people for years, and the entire subcontinent screamed in unison. And then we, of course, have the Royal Society of Sciences, which was founded in the mid-17th century. The Royal Society of Sciences claims to be the oldest independent scientific academy, although this can't be verified without considering much older universities and academies in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. They even have it there. The Western refusal to question what they have decided as false, just exists all throughout Western research. No one has asked, are they the oldest scientific institution? No one's asked it. They just assume it to be false. As such, the West tries to hold a monopoly on truth because all discoveries had to be verified and cataloged in Europe. Discoveries of species, etc. were pretty much impossible for any society that could not easily access Europe. So, the Europeans did not discover the platypus, they just cataloged it. And even now, we use Latin names and impose Eurocentric conventions on all science. Eurocentrism said that science was no longer the domain of the public. It took place in the new sacred space, the laboratory, under controlled conditions that do not reflect nature. The scientific method was applied to history, folk stories, and even mythology, with theologians attempting to prove the existence of God. The scientific method could, therefore, be used in this way in Western research on Gesar, but this has not been done. Research tends to concentrate on Gesar as another figure entirely. One scholar wrote a paper asking about Gesar being combined with the Chinese war deity Guangdi. Others ask if Gesar is simply a bastardization of the name Caesar. But the foundational question of was Gesar an actual warrior king in his own right is rarely, if ever, asked. The desire to look into this is actively discouraged, and I have frequently been told it is not viable or even that it is of no value and a waste of time. And in fact, yesterday on Google, when I decided to check the spelling and I looked up praise to Gesar, this is what I got. I took it personally. The missionaries haven't made it. So, now, here are my recommendations for future research using combined methods. As modern researchers, how do we explore the provability of Gesar in an ethical manner? The first thing is that we must recognize Gesar as a religious figure as well as a potentially historical one. This has been successfully done with people like Moses, the Buddha, Jesus, and Muhammad, and so we know that this can be done respectfully. We should look for independently verifiable accounts without disparaging religion and while still allowing space for faith. We must recognize that the rules of faith do not need to abide by the rules of science. We allow this flexibility for other religions, and yet for Western religions, and yet for some reason, racism, we tend to deny it for non-Western religions. Just as Bhutan has actually been monitored by Western science in Western hospitals, but not explained by it, we also must accept the possibility of phenomena that can exist without the permission of Western science. Oh, sorry. Yep. We should also look for corroborating evidence from neighboring countries. These would be viewed from a very different perspective. In fact, Gesar wouldn't be a hero, rather he would be a dangerous invading king and most likely the villain. But by finding these corroborating sources from other countries, we could make a time map of the actual events of King Gesar's life. Sorry about that. Slipped there. We should also research the artifacts held at Hana, Rioche, and Golok. These can be further researched, and there's even the possibility of carbon dating. I've been working closely with many lamas at Hana and Golok specifically, and have been building a good rapport, so I do believe that with continued respect they will participate. Now in this photo, we have some of the helmets of the heroes up front, some spearheads on the left, some mirrors in the center, and at the top you see that reddish folded thing. That is King Gesar's white felt hat. It's 900 years old, so it's not white anymore. But as far as we can tell, and I can say there is some documentation that provides very good evidence for provenance, that is his hat. We must recognize that the Western monopoly on scientific proof is unfair and should not be used to dictate research on Gesar. The West has created its own dogmatic canon of experiments which promotes flawed procedures by preventing questioning of so-called standard knowledge, which is a holdover from the 17th century Enlightenment. While we should not dismiss the Western approach, we need to consider it within the context of change in order to avoid the pitfalls of Eurocentric research. Scientific knowledge changes over time. My favorite example is the atom, which was literally named atom because it was believed to be the single smallest particle. But now even secondary school students know that we can split the atom and the atom has protons, electrons, etc. So what was scientifically true not many years ago has been proven false and is now common knowledge. Many a Western scientist has been disparaged as a fool, only to be proven right with time. Therefore, it is unscientific to dismiss the ideas of things we cannot explain, including thermas and inspired bards, without properly considering and researching them, which has not been done. We should understand that no one holds a monopoly on validation, and in fact, holding such a monopoly is dangerous. As we've seen in the case of malaria, it can be detrimental and even deadly. Rather than trying to prove Gesar solely through one idea of validity rather than another, we should, to truly try and seek the truth, we must approach through as many angles as possible. It is my great hope that in the future, Western scholars will work side by side with Tibetan and Himalayan scholars to respectfully research this treasure of Himalayan and world heritage. In order to gain as much knowledge as possible, I hope that we will not be blinded by culturally identified ideas of validity, and instead will throw aside the idea of member accounts versus stranger accounts and try to approach this subject anew, embracing the best of many sets of analytical methods. As I wrap up today, I would like to relay to you all a gift from Hana Monastery in Tibet, which we only got permission for last night. Hana Monastery, among its artifacts, holds the Lungzunka Dongta, or the resounding white conch of the Kingdom of Ling, that was used to call battles, to call meetings, etc. It is viewed as a liberation upon hearing. To my knowledge, there are no public recordings of it, and the reason you will see it is shot from a downward angle is because this is considered so special that every time the Lama pulled it out, every single person in the room would fall to their knees. So if I can have the sound here, please. So finally, I would like to express my thanks to all the people mentioned here and dedicate this to my mother, Amalia Rubin. And if you have any interest in contacting me with regards to this and ongoing research in regards to King Gesar, please do not hesitate to contact me. Thank you all for your time.